Chapter 26. The Murgo robe was made of coarse black cloth, and it had a strange emblem woven into the fabric just over Garion's heart. It smelled of smoke and of something else even more unpleasant. There was a small ragged hole in the robe just under the left armpit. The cloth around the hole was wet and sticky. Garion's skin cringed away from that wetness. They were moving rapidly up through the galleries of the last three levels of the slave pens, with the deep-cowled hoods of the Murgo robes hiding their faces. Though the galleries were lighted by city torches, they encountered no guards, and the slaves locked behind the pitted iron doors made no sound as they passed. Gary could feel the dreadful fear behind those doors. "How do we get into the city?" Dernick whispered. "There's a stairway at the upper end of the top gallery," Silk replied softly. "Is it guarded?" "Not any more." An iron-barred gate, chained and locked, blocked the top of the stairway, but Silk felt and drew a slim metal implement from one boot, probed inside the lock for a few seconds, then grunted with satisfaction as the lock clicked open in his hand. "I'll have a look," he whispered, and slipped out. Beyond the gate, Garion could see the stars, and outlined against them the looming buildings of Rakthal. A scream, agonized and despairing, echoed through the city, followed after a moment by the hollow sound of some unimaginably huge iron gong. Garion shuddered. A few moments later, Silk slipped back through the gate. "There doesn't seem to be anybody about," he murmured softly. "Which way do we go?" Belgrath pointed. "That way. We'll go along the wall to the temple." "The temple?" Relg asked sharply. "We have to go through it to get to Tuchik," the old man replied. "We're going to have to hurry. Morning isn't far off." Rakthal was not like other cities. The vast buildings had little of that separateness that they had in other places. It was as if the Murgos and Grolms who lived here had no sense of personal possession, so their structures lacked the insularity of individual property to be found among the houses in the cities of the West. There were no streets in the ordinary sense of the word, but rather interconnecting courtyards and corridors that passed between, and quite often through the buildings. The city seemed deserted as they crept silently through the dark courtyards and shadowy corridors, but there was a kind of menacing watchfulness about the looming silent black walls around them. Peculiar-looking turrets jutted from the walls in unexpected places, leaning out over the courtyards, brooding down at them as they passed. Narrow windows stared accusingly at them, and the arched doorways were filled with lurking shadows. An oppressive air of ancient evil lay heavily on Rakthal, and the stones themselves seemed almost to gloat as Garion and his friends moved deeper and deeper into the dark maze of the Grolm fortress. "Are you sure you know where you're going?" Beric whispered nervously to Belgarath. "I've been here before," the old man told him quietly. "I like to keep an eye on Tuchik from time to time. We go up those stairs. They'll take us to the top of the city wall." The stairway was narrow and steep, with massive walls on either side of the vaulted roof overhead. The stone steps were worn by centuries of use. They climbed silently. Another scream echoed through the city, and the huge gong sounded its iron note once more. When they emerged from the stairway, they were atop the outer wall. It was as broad as a highway and encircled the entire city. A parapet ran along its outer edge, marking the brink of the dreadful precipice that dropped away to the floor of the rocky wasteland a mile or more below. Once they emerged from the shelter of the buildings, the chill air bit at them, and the black flagstones and rough-hewn blocks of the outer parapet glittered with frost in the icy starlight. Belgrath looked at the open stretch lying atop of the wall ahead of them, and looked at the shadowy buildings looming several hundred yards ahead. "We'd better spread out," he whispered. "Too many people in one place attract attention in Rakthal. We'll go across here two at a time. Walk. Don't run or crouch down. Try to look as if you belong here. Let's go." He started along the top of the wall with Beric at his side, two of them walking purposefully, but not appearing to hurry. After a few moments, Aunt Paul and Mandaralon followed. "Dernick," Silk whispered. "Gary and I'll go next. You and Relg follow in a minute or so." He peered at Relg's face, shadowed underneath the Murgo hood. "Are you all right?" he asked. "As long as I don't look up at the sky," Relg answered tightly. His voice sounded as if he were coming from between clenched teeth. Come along then, Garion, Silk murmured. It required every ounce of Garion's self-control to walk at a normal pace across the frosty stones. It seemed somehow that eyes watched from every shadowy building, and the tower as he and the little Drasby had crossed the open section atop the wall. The air was dead calm and bitterly cold, and the stone blocks of the outer parapet were covered with a lacy filigree of rime frost. There was another scream from the temple lying somewhere ahead. The corner of a large tower jutted out at the end of the open stretch of wall, obscuring the walkway beyond. Wait here a moment, Silk whispered, as they stepped gratefully into its shadow and he slipped around the jutting corner. Garion stood in the icy dark, straining his ears for any sound. He glanced once toward the parapet far out on the desolate wasteland below. A small fire was burning. It twinkled in the dark light like a small red star. He tried to imagine how far away it might be. Then there was a slight scraping sound somewhere above him. He spun quickly, his hand going to his sword. A shadowy figure dropped from a ledge to the side of the tower several yards over his head and landed with cat-like silence on the flagstones directly in front of him. Garion caught a familiar sour acid reek of stale perspiration. It's been a long time, hasn't it, Garion? Brill said quietly with an ugly chuckle. Stay back, Garion warned, holding his sword with its point low as Beric had taught him. I knew that I'd catch you alone someday, Brill said, ignoring the sword. He spread his hands wide and crouched slightly, his cast eye gleaming in the starlight. Garion backed away, waving his sword threateningly. Brill bounded to one side, and Garion instinctively followed him with the sword point. Then, so fast that Garion could not follow, Brill dodged back and struck his hand down sharply on the boy's forearm. Garion's sword skittered away across the icy flagstones. Desperately, Garion reached for his dagger. Then another shadow flickered in the darkness at the corner of the tower. Brill grunted as a foot caught him solidly in the side. He fell, but rolled quickly across the stones and came back up onto his feet, his stance wide and his hands moving slowly in the air in front of him. Silk dropped his Murgo robe behind him, kicked it out of the way, and crouched, his hands also spread wide. Brill grinned. I should have known you were around somewhere, Keldar. I suppose I should have expected you too, Cordok, Silk replied. You always seem to show up. Brill flicked a quick hand towards Silk's face, but the little man easily dodged it. How do you keep getting ahead of us? He asked almost conversationally. That's a habit of yours that's starting to irritate Elgarath. He launched a quick kick at Brill's groin, but the cast-eyed man jumped back agilely. Brill laughed shortly. You people are too tender-hearted with horses, he said. I've had to ride quite a few of them to death chasing you. How did you get out of that pit? He sounded interested. Tar Urgas was furious the next morning. What a shame. He had the guards flayed. I imagine a Murgo looks a bit peculiar without his skin. Brill dove forward suddenly, both hands extended, but Silk sidestepped the lunge and smashed his hand sharply down in the middle of Brill's back. Brill grunted again, but rolled clear, farther out on the stones atop the wall. You might be just as good as they say, he admitted grudgingly. Try me, Cordok, Silk invited, with a nasty grin. He moved out from the wall of the tower, his hands in constant motion. Garion watched the two circling each other with his heart in his breath. Brill jumped again, with both feet lashing out, but Silk dove under him. They both rolled to their feet again. Silk's left hand flashed out, even as he came to his feet, catching Brill high on the head. Brill reeled from the blow, but managed to kick Silk's knee as he spun away. Your technique's defensive, Keldar, he grated, shaking his head to clear the effects of Silk's blow. That's a weakness. Just a difference of style, Cordok, Silk replied. Brill drove a gouging thumb at Silk's eye, but Silk blocked it and slammed a quick counterblow to the pit of his enemy's stomach. Brill scissored his legs as he fell, sweeping Silk's legs out from under him. Both men tumbled across the frosty stones and sprang to their feet again, their hands flickering, blows faster than Garion's eyes could follow them. The mistake was a simple one, so slight that Garen could not even be aware it was a mistake. Brill flicked a jab at Silk's face that was an ounce or two harder than it should have been, and traveled no more than a fraction of an inch too far. Silk's hands flashed up and caught his opponent's wrist with a deadly grip, and he rolled backward toward the parapet, his legs coiling even as the two of them fell. Jerked off balance, Brill seemed almost to dive forward. Silk's legs straightened suddenly, launching the cast-eyed man up and forward with a tremendous heave. With a strangled exclamation, Brill clutched desperately at one of the stone blocks of the parapet as he sailed over, but he was too high and his momentum was too great. He hurtled over the parapet, plunging out and down into the darkness below the wall. His scream faded horribly as he fell, lost in the sound of yet another shriek from the temple of Torak. Silk rose to his feet, glanced over the edge, and then came back to where Garion stood, trembling in the shadows by the tower wall. "Silk!" Garen exclaimed, catching the little man's arm in relief. "What was that?" Belgrath asked, coming back around the corner. "Brill," Silk replied blandly, pulling the Murgo robe back on. "Again?" Belgrath demanded with exasperation. "What was he doing this time?" "Trying to fly last time I saw him," Silk smirked. The old man looked puzzled. "He wasn't doing it very well," Silk added. Belgrath shrugged. "Maybe it'll come to him in time." "He doesn't really have all that much time." Silk glanced over the edge. Far from below, terribly far below, there came a faint muffled crash. Then, after several seconds, another. "Does bouncing count?" Silk asked. Belgrath made a wry face. "Not really." "Then I'd say he didn't learn in time," Silk said blithely. He looked around with a broad smile. "What a beautiful night this is," he remarked to no one in particular. "Let's move along," Belgrath suggested, throwing a quick, nervous glance at the eastern horizon. "It'll start to lighten up over there any time now." They joined the others in the deep shadows beside the high wall of the temple some 100 yards down the wall, and waited tensely for Relg and Durnick to catch up. "What kept you?" Beric whispered as they waited. "I met an old friend of ours," Silk replied quietly. His grin was a flash of white teeth in the shadows. "It was Brill," Garen told the rest of them in a hoarse whisper. "He and Silk fought with each other, and Silk threw him over the edge." Manderallen glanced toward the frosty parapet. "There's a goodly way down," he observed. "Isn't it, though?" Silk agreed. Beric chuckled and put his big hand wordlessly on Silk's shoulder. Then Durnick and Relg came along the top of the wall to join them in the shadows. "We have to go through the temple," Belgrath told them in a quiet voice. "Pull your hoods as far over your faces as you can, and keep your heads down. Stay in a single file and mutter to yourself as if you were praying. If anybody speaks to us, let me do the talking. And each time the gong sounds, turn toward the altar and bow." He led them down to a thick door bound with weathered iron straps. He looked back once to be sure they were all in line, then put his hand to the latch and pushed the door open. The inside of the temple glowed with a smoky red light, and a dreadful charnel house reek filled it. The door through which they had entered led onto a covered balcony that curved around the back of the dome of the temple. A stone balustrade ran along the edge of the balcony, with thick pillars at evenly spaced intervals. The openings between the pillars were draped with the same coarse, heavy cloth from which the Murgo robes were woven. Along the back wall of the balcony were a number of doors, set deep in the stone. Garen surmised that the balcony was largely used by temple functionaries going to and fro on various errands. As soon as they started along the balcony, Belgrath crossed his hands on his chest and led them in a slow, measured pace, chanting in a deep, loud voice. The scream echoed from below, piercing, filled with terror and agony. Garen involuntarily glanced through the parted drapery toward the altar. For the rest of his life, he wished he had not. The circular walls of the temple were constructed of polished black stone, and directly behind the altar was an enormous face forged of steel and buffed to mirror brightness, the face of Torak, and the original of the steel masks of the Grolums. The face was beautiful, there was no question of that. that there was a kind of brooding evil in it, a cruelty beyond human ability to comprehend the meaning of the word. The temple floor, facing the god's image, was densely packed with Murgos and Grolm priests, kneeling and chanting an unintelligible rumble in a dozen dialects. The altar stood on a raised dais, directly beneath the glittering face of Torak. A smoking brazier on an iron post stood at each front corner of the black-smeared altar, and a square pit opened in the floor immediately in front of the dais. Ugly red flames licked up out of the pit, and black oily smoke rolled from it toward the dome high above. A half-dozen Grolms in black robes and steel masks were gathered around the altar, holding the naked body of a slave. The victim was already dead, his chest gaping open like the chest of a butchered hog, and a single Grolm stood in front of the altar, facing the image of Torak with raised hands. In his right he held a long curved knife, in his left a dripping human heart. "Behold our offering, dragon god of Angarak," he cried in a huge voice, then turned and deposited the heart in one of the smoking braziers. There was a burst of steam and smoke from the brazier, and a hideous sizzle as the heart dropped into the burning coals. From somewhere beneath the temple floor, the huge iron gong sounded, its vibrations shimmering in the air. The assembled Murgos and their Grolm overseers groaned and pressed their faces to the floor. Garion felt a hand nudge his shoulder. Silk, already turned, was bowing toward the bloody altar. Awkwardly, sickened by the horror show, Garion also bowed. The 6 Grolms at the altar lifted the lifeless body of the slave almost contemptuously and cast it into the pit before the dais. Flames belched up, and smoke sparks in the thick smoke as the body fell into the fire below. A dreadful anger welled up in Garion. Without even thinking, he began to draw on his will, fully intent upon shattering that vile altar and the cruel image hovering above it into shards and fragments in a single cataclysmic unleashing of naked force. "Belgarion!" the voice within his mind said sharply. "Don't interfere. This isn't the time." "I can't stand it," Garion raged silently. "I've got to do something." "You can't. Not now. You'll rouse the whole city. Unclench your will, Belgarion." "Do it as he says, Garion." Aunt Paul's voice sounded quietly in his mind. The unspoken recognition passed between Aunt Paul's mind and the strange other mind as Garion helplessly let the anger and will drain out of him. "This abomination won't stand much longer, Belgarion," the voice assured him. "Even now the earth gathers to rid itself of it." And then the voice was gone. "What are you doing up here?" a harsh voice demanded. Garion jerked his eyes away from the hideous scene below. A masked and robed Grolm stood in front of Belgarath, blocking their way. "We are the servants of Torak," the old man replied in an accent that perfectly matched the gutturals of Murgo's speech. "All in Rakthal are the servants of Torak," the Grolm said. "You aren't attending the ritual of sacrifice. Why?" "We're pilgrims from Rakhaga," Belgarath explained. "Only just arrived in the Dread City. We were commanded to present ourselves to the hierarch of Rakhaga in the instant of our arrival. That stern duty prevents our participation in the celebration." The Grolm grunted suspiciously. "Could the revered priest of the Dragon God direct us to the chambers of our hierarch? We are unfamiliar with the Dark Temple." There was another shriek from below as the iron gong boomed, and the Grolm turned and bowed toward the altar. Belgarath gave a quick jerk of his head to the rest of them, turned and also bowed. "Go to the last but one," the Grolm instructed, apparently satisfied by their gestures of piety. "It will lead you down to the halls of the hierarchs. We are endlessly grateful to the priest of the Dark God," Belgarath thanked him, bowing. They filed past the steel-masked Grolm, their heads down and their hands crossed on their breasts, muttering to themselves as if in prayer. "Vile," Relm said sternly. "Obscenity! Abomination!" "Keep your head down," Silk whispered. "There are Grolms all around us." "As all gives me strength, I would risk until Rakthal is laid waste," Relm vowed in a fervent mutter. Belgarath had reached an ornately carved door near the end of the balcony, and he swung it open cautiously. "Is the Grolm still watching us?" he whispered to Silk. The old man glanced back at the priest standing some distance behind them. Yes. Wait, there he goes. The balcony's clear now. The sorcerer let the door swing shut and stepped instead to the last door on the balcony. He tugged the latch carefully, and the door opened smoothly. He frowned. It's always been locked before, he muttered. You think it's a trap? Beric grumbled, his hand dipping under the murder robe to find his sword hilt. It's possible, but we don't have much choice. Belgraf pulled the door open, and they all slipped through as another shriek came from the altar. The door slowly closed behind them as the gong shuttered the stones of the temple. They started down the worn stone steps beyond the door. The stairway was narrow and poorly lighted, and it went down sharply, curving always to the right. We're right up against the outer wall, aren't we? Silk asked, touching the black stones on his left. Belgarath nodded. The stairs lead down to Tuchik's private place. It continued down until the walls on either side changed from blocks to solid stone. He lives below the city? Silk asked, surprised. Yes, Belgrath replied. He built himself a sort of hanging turret off from the rock of the peak itself. Strange idea, Turnik said. Tuchik's a strange person, Paul told him grimly. Belgrath stopped them. The stairs go down another 100 feet, he whispered. There'll be 2 guards just outside the door to the turret. Not even Tuchik could change that, no matter what he's planning. Sorcerers? Beric asked softly. No, the guards are ceremonial more than functional. They're just ordinary Grolms. We'll rush them. That won't be necessary. I can get you close enough to deal with them, but I want it quick and quiet. The old man reached inside the Murgo robe and drew out a roll of parchment bound with a strip of black ribbon. He started down again with Beric and Mandarolan close behind him. The curve of the stairway brought a lighted area into view as they descended. Torches illuminated the back of the stone steps with a kind of antechamber hewn from the solid rock. 2 Grolm priests stood in front of a plain black door, their arms folded. Who approaches the Holy of Holies? One of them demanded, putting his hand to his sword hilt. A messenger, Belgrath announced importantly. I bear a message for the master from the hierarch of Rakgoska. He held the rolled parchment above his head. Approach, messenger. Praise the name of the disciple of the dragon god of Angarak, Belgrath boomed as he marched down the steps with Mandarolan and Beric flanking him. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped in front of the steel-masked guards. Thus have I performed my appointed task, he declared, holding out the parchment. One of the guards reached for it, but Beric caught his arm in a huge fist. The big man's other hand closed swiftly about the surprised Grolm's throat. The other guard's hand flashed toward his sword hilt, but he grunted and doubled over sharply as Mandarolan thrust a long, needle-pointed poignard up into his belly. With a kind of deadly concentration, the knight twisted the hilt of the weapon, probing with the point deep inside the Grolm's body. The guard shuddered when the blade reached his heart and collapsed with a long, gurgling sigh. Beric's massive shoulders shifted, and there was a grating crunch as the bones of the first Grolm's neck came apart in his deadly grip. The guard's feet scraped spasmodically on the floor for a moment, and then he went limp. I feel better already, Beric muttered, dropping the body. You and Mandarolan stay here, Belgrath told him. I don't want to be disturbed once I'm inside. We'll see to it, Beric promised. What about these? He pointed to the 2 dead guards. Dispose of them, Relg, Belgrath said shortly to the Olgo. Silk turned his back quietly as Relg knelt between the 2 bodies and took hold of them, one with each hand. There was a sort of muffled slithering as he pushed them down, sinking the bodies into the stone floor. Left a foot sticking out, Beric observed in a detached tone. Do you have to talk about it? Silk demanded. Belgrath took a deep breath and put his hand to the iron door handle. All right, he said to them quietly. Let's go then. He pushed open the door.